All right, folks, it's over. Anthony Joshua knocks out Jake Paul in the 6th round of their fight on Netflix.
It's fun. I love this sport. I gave it my all. It's fucking crazy. I had a blast, and thank you to all the fans and everyone.
Whoever believed that Jake Paul was going to win, that was an absolute fairy tale.
Jake Paul versus Anthony Joshua is over. Thank God. Thank God it's over. What a joke of a fight.
He's an idiot. There is no reason.
If Anthony Joshua puts 10-ounce gloves on and gets in a boxing ring and Jake Paul is in the other corner, this won't last long. This will last as long as Josh wants it to last.
From the minute he got into that ring, to get on the back foot and just start running around, was quite pathetic, to be honest with you.
There was never a world in which Jake Paul was going to beat Anthony.
The spectacle at the Casillas Center in Miami, Florida, has finally dimmed, leaving behind a silence that stands in stark contrast to the roar of the crowd that witnessed the collision between a YouTube sensation and a heavyweight titan. It is over, and the aftermath is as brutal as the conclusion itself. On the night of December 19, 2025, the world watched through the lens of Netflix as Anthony Joshua, a two-time unified heavyweight champion, dismantled the carefully constructed athletic narrative of Jake Paul. The fight, which ended decisively in the 6th round,
changing the sport.
Jake Paul is concerned because that's not boxing. He was just trying to survive. And when you try to survive in a fight, then the other guy can't knock you out because you're not looking to win.
Was not merely a loss on a record sheet. It was a physical dismantling that left the influencer-turned-boxer in a hospital bed with a double broken jaw, forced to confront the harsh, bone-shattering reality of professional combat sports. The event was a collision of two worlds, the high-octane, algorithm-driven universe of social media celebrity and the cold, hard steel of elite heavyweight boxing. And the result was exactly what purists had predicted, yet perhaps more damaging than Paul's camp ever anticipated. The atmosphere leading up to the bout was thick with the usual theatrics, but the conclusion was etched in pain rather than glory. Jake Paul, who has spent the last few years building a reputation as a disruptor in the boxing world, found himself staring up at the lights, his jaw snapped, his equilibrium shattered, and his record dropped to 12-2. The final sequence in the 6th round was clinical. Joshua, who critics noted looked somewhat unmotivated and lackluster for parts of the fight, eventually found the openings he needed. A stinging jab followed by a glancing right hook was enough to send Paul to the canvas for the final time, ending a bout where he had already been dropped twice in the 5th round and twice in the 6th. It was a masterclass in the difference between learning to box and being a born fighter, a distinction that became painfully clear as Paul was carted off to surgery rather than a post-fight press conference. In the immediate wake of the fight, the bravado that usually defines Jake Paul's persona was replaced by a grim medical update. The man who had boasted about knocking people out was now communicating through text, updating his millions of followers from a hospital bed at Miami University Hospital. Just got out of surgery. Everything went smoothly, he wrote, a stark departure from his pre-fight trash talk. He acknowledged the severity of the situation, noting the immense pain and stiffness, and the reality that he would be consuming nothing but liquids for at least a week. It was a humbling moment for a figure who has built an empire on invincibility and noise. The diagnosis of a double broken jaw is not a minor setback. It is a career-altering injury that requires extensive rehabilitation. Medical experts and industry insiders have already begun to speculate on the timeline, suggesting that the 4 to 6 week initial recovery is merely for the bone to knit, while the psychological and physical readiness to take a punch again could take up to a year. For a fighter whose business model relies on constant activity and visibility, this forced hiatus is a devastating blow. The reaction from the combat sports community was a mixture of vindication, concern, and savage critique. Duke McKenzie, a voice of reason amidst the chaos, offered a scathing assessment of Paul's performance, comparing it to a scene from a martial arts comedy rather than a professional prize fight. McKenzie noted that Paul looked like the drunken master, stumbling over his own feet, lunging ineffectively, and failing to gauge the distance against a significantly taller and more skilled opponent. The size difference was palpable. When Paul faced off against previous opponents, he often held the physical advantage, but against Joshua, he was the smaller man looking up at a mountain. McKenzie pointed out the futility of Paul's offense. Every time he tried to throw a shot, he would fall short, leaving himself exposed to the punishing reach of the former champion. It was a mismatch that Mackenzie and many others felt should never have been sanctioned, describing the venture as nonsense that needs to stop before permanent damage occurs. A warning that seems to have arrived too late given the X-rays of Paul's jaw. Former UFC champion Michael Bisping did not mince words either, calling the fight a masterclass for Joshua but also highlighting the sheer disparity in skill. Bisping, a longtime supporter of Joshua, admitted that AJ looked unmotivated, perhaps bored by the lack of a genuine threat. Yet that version of Joshua was still enough to break Paul physically. Bisping described the fight not as a contest of equals, but as a question of how long Paul could survive. He noted that Paul spent the majority of the fight running, utilizing the expansive 22-foot ring, a size often demanded by fighters who plan to move, to escape the inevitable. Bisping critiqued the refereeing as well, suggesting the official should have separated the clinches faster, as Paul repeatedly turned the boxing match into a wrestling grappling session whenever Joshua got too close. Despite the criticism of Joshua's aggression, the damage was undeniable. Bisping emphasized that Paul never once worried Joshua, never rang his bell, and never posed a credible threat. It was, in his view, a display of survival instincts rather than boxing prowess. Interestingly, amidst the physical wreckage of his boxing ambitions, Jake Paul began pivoting his narrative toward a completely different field, the NFL. In the days surrounding the fight, Paul began hinting at a transition to professional football, a move that many view as a coping mechanism or a strategic distraction from the boxing defeat. He spoke with a straight face about wanting to play safety for the Cleveland Browns, claiming he could run a 4.34-minute 40-yard dash and possess the hands and power to deck people. This abrupt shift in athletic focus was met with skepticism and amusement. When asked if he was serious, Paul insisted he was legitimate, claiming he played football his whole life and was willing to sacrifice his body to make tackles. The absurdity of a man with a freshly broken jaw talking about colliding with NFL running backs was lost on no one. Yet it highlights the relentless, almost delusional ambition that drives Paul's career. He operates in a world where attention is the currency, and if he cannot get it as a victorious boxer, he will seek it as an aspiring football player, regardless of the feasibility. The discourse online was far less forgiving than the analysts. The rigged narrative, a constant shadow over Paul's previous victories, was violently dispelled by the image of his broken face. Sean Jones, an observer of the fight, pointed out the irony. For months, skeptics shouted that the fight would be scripted, a clown show designed to protect legacies and bank accounts. The X-rays of a snapped jaw, however, tell a story that no scriptwriter would authorize for their protagonist. Jones emphasized that while Joshua might not have unleashed his full, earth-shattering power in the early rounds, the injury proves the authenticity of the violence. You cannot fake a double jaw break. This sentiment was echoed by fans who felt a grim sense of satisfaction that the circus had finally met a serious consequence. Social media platforms were flooded with comments from users expressing relief that the integrity of the sport had been upheld, with some explicitly stating their joy at seeing Paul silenced, quite literally, by the injury. The fight also exposed the strategic limitations of Jake Paul's boxing career. Analysts Brian Campbell and Shaquille Majuri broke down the bout for CBS Sports, highlighting that Paul's survival into the sixth round was largely due to a game plan focused entirely on elusiveness. By requesting a larger ring and focusing on lateral movement, Paul was able to avoid being cornered for the first half of the fight. However, Campbell and Majuri questioned the long-term viability of this strategy. If the goal is to become a cruiserweight champion, as Paul has claimed, one cannot win titles by running away. They noted that Paul has effectively turned himself into a professional heel, a villain character from wrestling lore whom people pay to see beaten. The audience for this fight didn't tune in for a competitive chess match. They tuned in to see if Anthony Joshua would finally deliver the comeuppance that Anderson Silva, Tyron Woodley, and Nate Diaz could not. In that sense, the event was a massive success. The villain was defeated, the hero, or at least the professional, prevailed, and the audience got their pound of flesh. Yet, despite the mockery and the injury, there remains a grudging respect for Paul's willingness to step through the ropes. Wade, another commentator, pointed out that regardless of the skill gap, stepping into the ring with a two-time heavyweight champion requires a level of intestinal fortitude that most critics lack. Wade noted that while Paul was nowhere near Joshua's level in terms of speed, power, or endurance, the mere act of facing him was audacious. He predicted that 2026 would likely be a slow year for Paul, given the recovery time needed for his jaw, but the business of Jake Paul is never truly closed. Wade speculated that future matchups could include massive money fights against the likes of Canelo Alvarez or a long-awaited clash with Tyson Fury, though he cautioned that Paul needs to decide if he wants to be a boxer or a businessman. The beating he took from Joshua suggests that the ceiling on his boxing ability has been found, and it is significantly lower than the elite level he aspires to.